everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. We all have our fears, some small like spiders, some inexplicable like ghosts or a fear of the dark. And many of us, one way or another, fear the unknown. Have you ever considered what lies beneath the surface of the ocean? The mysteries that occupy its depths? Imagine the horrifying sight of a colossal squid, its giant eyes staring back at you from the darkness. And that's a creature we already know about. But the ocean in all its vastness holds a plethora of terrifying wonders, some defying our understanding. Undiscovered monstrous creatures lurking in the abyss, their otherworldly forms likely witnessed by few, or is it many, and only a few are given the chance to share their story. Tonight we focus on the stories of those who have witnessed something truly terrifying. These encounters will transport us to a world where the waves hold secrets. As you listen, ponder the question, what scares you? So, let's get started, shall we? My grandpa spent his life on fishing boats in the North Sea, and he passed down a lot of stories before his stroke in 2016. Most of them involved giant waves, sinking ships, or piracy, but there was one instance he only spoke of a few times. If you aren't familiar with the North Sea, it's among the most dangerous bodies of water in the world. Grandpa worked on one of the larger boats, but even the biggest get tossed around like toys. Severe storms appear suddenly and unpredictably. The waves were so violent that the men were thrown about the ship without warning. Broken bones and concussions were just routine hazards of the job. Of course, that was nothing compared to falling overboard. That's why any man walking on the deck was tethered to a safety line. The day in question was one of the rare brighter days, but those came with their own dangers. Pirates were far more active on those occasions. Grandpa was one of the men posted to keep watch while the others brought in the nets. These giant nets were lifted with a crane and capable of supporting more than 1,000 pounds, so we're talking durable stuff here. But this time, it only rose a few feet before coming to a grinding halt. Grandpa had a better view from his position, but even he could only see the line disappearing beneath the surface. The crane was under too much strain and quickly switched off, but the awful grinding noise didn't stop. Next, the line suddenly went slack. The net was rising again, but only for a second. It then went tight with great force and seemed to be pulled out to sea. The ship was dragged behind it for a short distance before the line fell slack again. While most of the crew were distracted with bringing in the net, my grandpa and 2 others were still watching the water. They saw a giant ripple appear. It was more than 3 times the length of the boat as something began rising to the surface. Grandpa thought that he was about to see some kind of military submarine, but instead, it was a fishtail, half the size of a blue whale. Not that you typically see blue whales in the North Sea, but it's supposed to be the largest creature in the world. Yet here was something that had an equally as large of a tail, possibly bigger. Only the finned part emerged, and it quickly disappeared again with a hard slap that sent a dangerous wave crashing into the side of the ship. You never want a wave to hit you from the side. They're lucky it didn't take them down, but it did knock Grandpa from his post. If not for the safety line, I would have probably never been born. When order was finally restored, the empty net was pulled back onto the boat. Something had ripped it apart. The ends hadn't been cut or chewed through. They had been pulled apart by brute force. Men who spend their lives at sea tend to be a superstitious bunch, and these guys were no different. By the time they learned what Grandpa and the other two witnessed, they were all ready to sail back to port, even though they had 3 weeks left on the hitch. I guess a lot of people would find a new profession, but there weren't a lot of job opportunities in my family's area, so my grandfather spent another 30 years at sea before finally retiring. It was a common lifestyle where they were from. My dad moved to the U.S. for college, where he met my mother, and we've been in Illinois ever since. I don't put much stock into ghosts or monsters, but we don't know what the hell might be out there in the oceans. I don't play when it comes to that stuff. I come from one of those small towns where nothing exciting ever happens. If there's a crime or a deadly accident, it will be news for generations. A few years ago, a man we'll call Ray learned his wife was at her boyfriend's house, so he drove over to see them. Upon arriving, he retrieved his handgun from the glove compartment and proceeded to kick in the back door. When he made it to the hallway, the boyfriend emerged from the bedroom, half-dressed and mad as hell. Then, Ray shot him without warning or hesitation. Next, he entered the bedroom and shot his wife, neither of which survived. It was the middle of the afternoon, so none of the neighbors were home to hear the gunshots. Ray simply went about his day as if all were normal. He used his wife's phone to text her boss that she was sick, and then returned to work himself, thinking that nobody would find the bodies anytime soon. That evening, the boyfriend's son returned home after football practice to find the body of his father in the hallway. Once police arrived, they quickly located Ray's wife, and it became fairly obvious what had occurred. By that time, Ray was home from work, so detectives drove to his house, where they delivered the bad news. Ray had a reputation for being that kind of asshole. There was little doubt of his guilt, but they wanted to get him to the station without a struggle. Whatever his response, he was asked to come make a statement, but he promptly refused, saying that he would prefer to bring his lawyer with him the following morning. The detectives took this as a further sign of guilt and were resigned to watch the house from a distance while awaiting a search warrant. An hour later, Ray emerged from his house with a suitcase and hurried into his car. He was clearly making a run for it. In his haste, he ran a stop sign, so the detectives turned on their lights, but Ray only increased his speed. Before he was even out of the subdivision, news began to spread with the speed that only the smallest towns can manage. The search warrant was also approved this time, so police were already entering his home while more joined in the developing pursuit. Roadblocks were put into place and spike strips were prepared but never needed. Just before the first trap, Ray pulled onto a frontage road where he collided with a Ford Taurus at 65 miles an hour, killing himself and the other driver instantly. The sole occupant of the Taurus just so happened to be a town treasure. He was the owner of a locally famous bakery that our entire community will swear is the best in the world. I've had family and friends move all over the world, only to come home wanting his desserts on every visit. I've been in a fair few places myself. I've never found anywhere that comes close. There wasn't a single resident who didn't mourn his loss. He had been leaving the bakery late and just got off the phone with his wife. She warned him of the pursuit happening nearby, so he decided to take the frontage road in order to avoid the highway. She still blames herself for the accident, but she and her son have kept the bakery running. It might or might not be the best in the world, but it's the best I've ever had. Most of all, it absolutely terrifies me how much damage one sorry jackass can do in so little time. My dad was a sonar tech in the Navy for 15 years and spent a lot of his time on submarines, specifically testing the new ones. He told me many stories from his time at sea, but he never revealed why he quit the Navy until I was in my mid-20s. His crew had been assigned to test a new model, built to go in deeper waters for longer periods. When they reached their target depth, they began running the next round of tests, and the sonar detected a large range of hills along the seafloor. It had a giant round mound over 200 feet high, with several small ridgelines stretching out of its center. My dad described it as if someone had taken a giant octopus and laid it with its legs splayed outwards. The following day, they continued along their route and made it to the next checkpoint for mapping and the various tests. Only this time, there was a problem with the results. The octopus-like mass was closer than it should have been, and some of its legs were at the wrong angle. It seemed their navigation had somehow taken them off course, so everything had to stop while they figured out what was wrong and how to fix it. They spent the entire day checking every part of their systems, but they couldn't find the error. In addition, everything else on the sonar was exactly where it should be. So how was this mini mountain range in a new position, like it had followed them? After another round of tests and checks yielded the same results, they received orders to proceed to the next checkpoint. There, it was the same story. Everything seemed to work perfectly, except the sonar showed the mass as being the same distance from them as the previous days, and the legs were once again in new positions. All of the data was reading as if those hills were actually following them along the ocean floor, like they were alive. Every crew member was an experienced sailor. They all had heard stories about prehistoric creatures still living in the sea. Some of the men were starting to think the landmass was actually one of those monsters, that its shape wasn't a coincidence. They held their position overnight, but there were no further changes in the seascape. Being unable to determine the equipment's malfunction or quell the rising panic amongst the crew, they were ultimately ordered to abort the mission and begin their ascent. They had only risen a few hundred feet when the sonar showed one of those legs moving towards them. Whatever that mass happened to be, it was alive. It wasn't moving fast. Whether it didn't feel the need to or simply couldn't is unknown. But the long appendages dwarfed the submarine. It would be all too simple to crush them beneath its colossal weight. With no time to spare, the captain gave the order to fire or torpedo and increase to full speed. The creature took a hit and let out a sound that haunted my father until the day he died. He couldn't describe it except to say that it felt like the ocean itself was crying in pain. Every man on the sub froze as a shockwave from the explosion carried them helplessly away. The sonar was rendered useless during this time. At first, they believed it was damaged in the blast, but once the creature fell silent, it began to function normally once again. 2 days later, the Navy sent 2 teams down in hopes of eliminating the creature and recovering its body for study. But after more than 3 weeks of searching, there was simply no sign of it. My dad, along with most of his crewmates, never felt safe in the water again. Several were discharged, but my father managed to finish the last months of his contract. He had always planned to stay in the Navy until he retired, but thanks to this experience, he decided to sell cars instead. It was a huge change to our lifestyle, but I was just a kid who missed her dad. I thought he wanted more time at home, and for years afterwards, he never let us see the trauma beneath the surface. That's just the kind of man he was. Then, last year, he passed away after a long battle with cancer, and I've been thinking about his old stories a lot. So, I thought it might be good to share this one. If you spend a lot of time out at sea, please stay safe. there's so much we still don't know about the ocean. I'm a preschool teacher. The school I work at serves primarily Section 8 housing. Our funding for the school is low on resources across the board. Low staffing, low quality, and low quantity of classroom materials, low access to grants. I could go on, but I digress. Because all educators know, our job is to create the future. I just so happen to work in an area where a lot of futures have a 50-50 shot of going to prison or breaking the cycle. The elementary school my students end up going to is down the block from the preschool. I've seen success stories, triumphs against all odds, but alongside those star students are a million that will eventually grow up to fill the shoes of an adult who grew up in their similar circumstances, etched into their being. A vicious cycle, if you will. My partner tells me that I've grown colder to the world. I can't help but to agree. Here's an example of thoughts that have actually gone through my head this week. I'd only admit this through anonymity. But driving to work, I assist with preparing breakfast for the children that arrive early, so it's usually dark on my drive there. I was driving, entering city limits, where I'm usually met with a cluster of junkies on the sidewalk, hunched over, nodding off. This morning, I can see a shirtless man with a shopping cart zigzagging in the middle of a 3-lane highway. Speed limit's 45 on that road. I maintained 45 miles per hour and continued down the lane I was originally traveling in, thinking, I'm not stopping or swerving if this guy wanders in front of me. I'm in the very right lane. He's giving me a 1 to 3 chance that I can take the day off. I call my boss from the scene of the accident. Tell him some homeless man just jumped through my windshield. He'd obviously not expect me to be coming in after something like that. The shopping cart would probably get so fucking embedded in the grill of my car that I couldn't very well drive it to work even if my boss did expect me to come in. The S pattern this guy's doing looks like it's coming back into my lane. I'm 100 yards away, 45 miles an hour. I'm driving a little over 20 yards per second. It's a 5 count. I come within inches of clipping him. In my rearview mirror, I watch him drift into the middle lane and continue his highway escapade, completely oblivious to how very close he came to dying. I'm sure my future self is glad it didn't happen, but at the time, I had no empathy for that man or his situation. So, to say I'm mentally exhausted would be the understatement of the year, but my spirit stays strong for the children in my classroom. It makes my day brighter when I can make their day brighter, as they come into my classroom from the hell their subjective home life provides them. So now comes the story that brings me here, I guess. A few months ago, a new student enrolled and was placed into my classroom. The guardians of the child, who we'll call Leon, consisted of his mother, Sasha, a 20-year-old woman who spoke English as a second language. Our primary communication and translator for the family was a man named Angelo. He was Leon's uncle and second guardian. Angelo was also in his 20s and Sasha's brother. The 3 of them lived in low-income housing apartments provided by the state. Sasha worked at a fast food restaurant. Angelo worked at a hotel. They both worked long hours on switch shifts in order to be there for Leon. Angelo was also taking online classes trying to get his degree. They were the epitome of everything our preschool strived for with our families, working hard for a better future. Where I work, it's not luxurious. It's not supposed to be. It should feel like liminal space. You can find a better, safer place to live, but only if you work for it. Some people are content with this life. The apartments around my school will always be filled. But there will also be tenants who use this as a stepping stone to move up, and that's the goal. It's the reason I show up to work, to show hope to the hopeless, give a boost to the fighters who deserve more than what life has provided. At the beginning of this month, Leon wasn't in attendance for a whole week. The office told me that his mom called sounding distraught, told them that it was a family emergency. Because of her limited English, she wasn't able to explain or advise when Leon would be back. On that Friday, after the children had left, I was organizing my classroom, preparing take-home packets as next week was the final week before spring break. I'm shuffling through papers at my desk when I hear a gentle knock on one of the glass windows on the other side of the room. I look up and it's Angelo. He waves at me, and I was happy to see him standing there. I came out from around my desk, and I go out the side door to greet him. I had so many questions. I didn't want to overstep my boundaries, but I really cared about this family. When I come out, I'm like, Angelo, hey man, it's so good to see you. Sasha called, told us there was an emergency. How's it going? Is Leon okay? Angelo smiles, and he tells me everything will be all right, that Leon will be in class on Monday. I'm so relieved. I leave my questions there. He tells me, thank you for all the love. I said something like, of course, man, thanks for being you. He leaves, and I go back into my classroom to finish the last of my tasks before going home. The weekend passes and Monday comes. Leon's in class. He's noticeably somber. Midday, having his friends back around him made his heart perk up a little. He was conversing more with his peers. Throughout the day, I would ask, how are you feeling? And it was finally met with an answer instead of the silence he'd been holding on to. With a sigh, he tells me, Tio's gone. I say that I'm sorry to hear that. Then another child distracts Leon's attention with a dinosaur toy, and I'm grateful to see his eyes light up again. I try not to give him any more reasons to think about something sad that day. That afternoon, Sasha comes to pick up Leon. A friend from work has accompanied her, and she introduces herself and tells me Sasha brought me so I can explain what happened. Leon runs up and grabs Sasha's leg. The woman tells me that Angelo unalived himself last Monday. The cops were at Sasha's door as she was waking up that morning. 3 hours earlier, a man had jumped from the roof of the hotel building, and they needed her to identify the body. I'm in disbelief. I begin to stammer out that I just saw him on Friday, but tears quickly begin to fill the bottoms of my eyelids. Whatever I saw outside my window last week could mentally be sorted out later. At that moment, I knew not to protest. I couldn't stop the tears from forming in my eyes, and they immediately filled my eyes when I accepted the news as truth. I told her thank you. Sasha and I didn't engage with words. I didn't want to completely break down in front of my student. I had to be strong. I put my hand on her shoulder, and we looked at each other before they turned around and left. I really don't know how to end this. I really don't know why I started writing it to begin with. I do feel better for it, though. The world is dark, and it only becomes more opaque the longer you look. All you can do is try your best to make it a better place, and hope the next person will do the same. Be kind to one another. You don't know what real horrors families face every day. What you have does not make you who you are. An uncle of mine works at a software company in India. Last night he called my father, but it went to voicemail because he was asleep. Today at breakfast, we were all in the dining room. I was helping my mother clear the table while my father finished getting ready for work. He remembered that my uncle had called and left a voicemail, so he put the phone on speaker while he was fastening the buttons on his shirt. When the voicemail started to play, the sound was distorted from the amount of volume on the other side. We could hear men and women yelling all around my uncle as he tried to leave the message for my dad. We couldn't understand what he was saying, and after 30 or 40 seconds, the phone turned off and the message ended. At once, my father stopped what he was doing and picked up the phone to call my uncle. He turns off the speaker and presses it against his ear when it starts to ring. Then I watch his look of panic melt when my uncle answers the phone. He says, "I just listened to your message. Are you okay?" My uncle tells him that the company he works for was celebrating an anniversary, and the CEOs rented out a large stage at a movie studio to host the event. Everyone was sitting at tables, talking with one another and watching the giant LED screens on stage. Now, it's known within the family that my uncle possesses the ability to interact with spirits. More so, spirits tend to interact with my uncle a lot. He's had this ability since he and my father were children. When their grandmother died, she told my uncle where her will had been filed, days after the funeral was held. They call them bhutas in India, restless spirits that walked out of the light, instead choosing to stay on Earth and influence the living for good and bad intentions. On the phone, still talking to my dad, my uncle tells him that the place where this event took place was saturated in negative energy, a place no god had claimed. Way above their heads were rows of large metal rafters with automated lasers and spotlights pointed at the floor of the stage. My uncle says through the glare of the lights, he could see the bhutas in the darkest parts near the ceiling, sitting on the metal beams. These inky black figures were also waiting for the show to start. Soon, everyone's attention was directed towards the stage, as rounds of pyrotechnics shot bursts of flames into the air. Then the spotlights all turned up and moved together to make one singular circle. Focused in the beam of light was a large green cage hoisted high above the center stage. The bars were equipped with fireworks that began to shower down fountains of sparks. The crowd erupted with cheers and claps. Then, from the scaffolding bridge, the CEO and another man walk into the green cage, waving at the excited audience. The cage was intended to lower the men down onto the stage for a grand entrance. The machine comes to life, and the green cage starts shaking and wobbling. Both men grab the railings as they're almost knocked off balance. Gasps were heard, but the CEO never stopped smiling, and the crowd kept cheering. The cage shakes again. This time, one of the cables snapped, turning the cage sideways. The sudden failure sends both of the men tumbling over the railing of the cage, falling more than 20 feet to the ground. My uncle says it was obvious the CEO was dead by the way he had landed. And then it got loud. There was confusion as well from anyone who had not witnessed the event. Confusion and panic. It created absolute chaos for several minutes. My uncle found a safe space against a wall, avoiding being rushed by a group of employees and their families. That's when he finally decided to call my father. He'd already had his phone in his hand, having almost called him earlier when he'd seen the bhutas. He felt like something was going to happen and wanted to speak to his family. Now that something had happened, my uncle felt he might be in danger. He was physically safe against the wall, but he feared if he moved at all, the bhutas would find a way to target him. Just as he had that thought, his phone was knocked from his hands and away from him. He knew it wasn't safe to move. Some people may call that paranoia, but I don't think so. My uncle has had experiences prior to this, ones I mentioned earlier and others. I think he has the right to be a little wary of such things. Needless to say, he did escape unharmed, and the company's president, the other man, was critically injured but survived the accident. Still, it's all very unfortunate, and I think it's rather chilling in more than one way. Thanks for reading. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open for more deep sleep videos. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support the Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/thedarkesthour, or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.